Welcome back to Four Corners. Are all drugs bad? In a relative world, the impact that each drug has demands perhaps individual scrutiny. However, the stigma attached to them, censorious attitudes and prescriptive legislation have meant society's view may have been adjusted to see drugs as illicit and therefore unwarrantable, or conversely illicit and so therefore attractive. The generalizations about drugs may also hinder a useful understanding of the varied and variable impacts of the many different substances concerned. For those who argue against wholesale legalization, like Ms. Boyd that we saw in the first half, alcohol offers an example of a widely tolerated drug whose negative social effects are arguably most widely felt. But are there examples of other drugs which, once legalized, would cause less harm? Or is further restriction, including drugs currently lawful, the way to go? On Four Corners, once again, we have Deirdre Boyd in London, and joining us in this half, I hope, will be David Borden very shortly in Washington. I'll begin with you, though. You're there, are you, Mr. Borden? Good to have you on the program, sir. Can you describe the effect on consumption that decriminalization has had on something like cannabis as opposed to being as opposed to it being legal or made legal?
Well, decriminalization or tolerance, for example, as we have in the Netherlands, the rate of cannabis use is roughly half of what some of the neighboring countries have, including France. So it's not really clear that the policies, that the legal policies and how people are punished or not is what determines use rates.
Yeah, but
here in various states here in the U.S., where we've had lowering of penalties, having fine regimes for cannabis instead, for example, there was not an increase in use. So it may be a fairly separate question.
Thank you. But Deirdre Boyd in the first half said that where there may have been a reduction in the use of cannabis, there has been an increase, something of a correlative increase in the use of harder drugs like heroin and cocaine.
Well, I'm aware of correlations that have been found between the use of cannabis and the use of alcohol. I'm not aware of such correlations between cannabis and harder drugs. I know what the Dutch feel, and now no one is doing legalization right now, and no one has for several decades at a minimum. So it's not an exact comparison, but in the Netherlands, their view certainly is that by keeping the market separate, they are not having an increase in that they're actually their average age of heroin addicts is increasing, indicating that fewer young people are getting onto the drug. But I think we should look at the big picture. Opium and its derivative products like heroin, coca and cocaine, these were banned in 1914. That's almost a century ago. And yet UN officials this week talked about the Taliban making $100 million on the opium trade, and last year's crop being twice as much as is needed to serve the annual global drug supply, which means they're saving it in case there's some other problems. So we're obviously not cutting off the supply of drugs. And I also believe the public health issues related to addictive drugs like heroin are more complex than merely how many people are using.
So David Borden, do you argue for an end to prohibition? Do you argue for the scrapping of the current legal statutes that are there? And what do you favor?
We do favor ending prohibition, and our view is that nations and in countries like the U.S. where states have authority will come up with different systems that they'll try, and will make agreements how to deal with border and neighbor issues. But we'll learn through experience how to regulate drugs effectively and reduce the harms that they do in that way.
So
we have hundreds of billions of dollars every year
says,
going into the criminal underground.
Yeah, it's
so there are a number of problems with what Mr. Gordon says.
It's boredom.
And the first is that he is first of all, while he may be happy to do experiments, he's experimenting with people's lives. The second one is an earlier point he made, which was inaccurate, in which he said those states in which cannabis was legal, the cannabis use went down. In fact, the school children in those states, all the schools in those states were in the worst 10 for cannabis use of school children. These are the people of the future. You cannot gamble with their lives and their mental health. And that is the research. You cannot argue against that research in favor of ideological experiments.
Now, before we continue, Miss Boyd,
well,
just bear with me, Miss Boyd. It's David Boredom in Washington, not Gordon, and he has that's okay. He has a slight time delay on hearing you, so I'd appreciate it very much if you just give him a chance to interject, so that you don't wind up talking over each other. David Boredom, what's your response?
This is incorrect information. Research, and I can't name the exact studies today, but I know Mark Kleiman, one of our top drug policy academics here, has written about it. Decriminalization attempted in various U.S. states, not legalization, we don't have it, you don't have it, but decriminalization did not lead to an increase in use. We also, and this is not exactly the same issue, but a report just came out in the past week, I believe, on states that have enacted medical marijuana laws, and it actually found that the use decreased. And again, in the Netherlands, their use rate is roughly half of what the rate is in some of the neighboring countries, including France. So I don't believe that Ms. Boyd is providing correct information on this topic. But the big picture, since cannabis truly is not the problem that most people are worried about, because people aren't injecting it and killing themselves with it, we have to look at nearly a century of drug prohibition, and yet the very drugs are as available, perhaps more available, as they were before. We have a tremendous criminal underground with profound impacts on public safety. The criminal underground environment that users are subject to has profound impacts on their life stability and their ability to stay healthy or even survive until they can recover. And so it's clearly not working. If we are serious about public safety, and I believe if we're serious about public health, we need to move to regulation, not prohibition. And then continue to help people with recovery, continue to educate, continue to do treatment, continue to do harm reduction.